Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me all right at the back? That sounds okay. Good. Well, I'd like to start by thanking the organisers very much for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be part of this event. I find it so cheering, student organisations getting together and pushing things forward. I mean, it's something that's happening worldwide, and it's taken on a momentum which I've never seen before. I mean, I've seen student organisations come and go in the past, but I feel it's different this time. And I think headway is being made. And the fact that we're all here together to talk about teaching and to think about new ways of teaching from a pluralist perspective, I think is tremendously encouraging. And makes me feel optimistic about the future, which is a nice thing to feel. I chose the title of Pluralist Economics, Is It Scientific? It's a little provocative, but in a way this is what we face. I mean, particularly if we're engaged in discussions within departments or with mainstream organizations about changing the curriculum in economics, we have to be persuasive that this is scientific, whatever that means. Well, I'll give you my definition of science. It is a systematic procedure for generating reliable knowledge. Now, that maybe sounds kind of straightforward, but the trouble is we don't all agree on what reliable knowledge is. And that's where the discussion starts. So really the question that I'm posing here is, do we have a better chance of producing reliable knowledge from monism, in other words, one approach to economics that everybody agrees on, or do we have a better chance of building up reliable knowledge from a pluralist perspective? In other words, allowing for and fostering a range of approaches to economics. So I'm going to focus on pluralism in the sense of methodological pluralism, the idea of there being a range of approaches to economics. I mean, I know in the discussions over the next couple of days, there will be discussions about pluralism in other senses, pluralism of methods, a pluralistic methodology and pluralist methods of teaching. But I want to focus on the idea of different approaches to economics. And then the way in which we can approach this question is to think about the notion of reliability and which is the best way of achieving that. Now, to help me address this question, I want to go back to the work of Thomas Kuhn and his Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which was written in the early 60s and was a challenge that many people found very appealing to an authoritarian view of science. Science was dominated, or philosophy of science at the time was dominated by Karl Popper's view that it was possible to establish the best procedure for producing reliable knowledge, and his argument was that falsification was the way to get concrete results. We could achieve certainty by, at least we could all agree by what has been falsified by the evidence, even if we couldn't agree about what had been confirmed by the evidence. But what Kuhn pointed out as a historian of science was that that's not how science, and he was focusing on physical science, actually proceeds. That what tends to happen is that you have a dominant approach, and then some anomalies arise which become overwhelming, and that approach is overthrown and another approach takes its place, and that we have a succession of these paradigms. And a paradigm is something that's a complex, ranging from, I can use the word here, I have to explain it to students, but Weltanschauung is, if I'm pronouncing it properly, is the sort of basis of a paradigm. And it goes from there right to the methods that one chooses to pursue that vision of the way the world works. And for our purposes, it's quite important that Kuhn explained that this process works substantially through education, that it's through textbooks using exemplars that students' minds are molded to fit with the dominant paradigm. And this is a very effective tool. Now, it's kind of controversial to talk about Kuhn because some people argue that Kuhn actually provides a justification for monism. Because Kuhn said that there's no overarching universal set of criteria by which you can decide which paradigm is best, then that, in a way, provides a justification for the continuing dominance of the mainstream approach. So some people think that Kuhn's philosophy of science is actually anti-pluralist, that it provides a justification for the continuation of the mainstream. I can see where that argument's coming from, but where I find Kuhn really useful is in helping us understand why we're in this situation with a dominant mainstream and how we analyze coexisting paradigms. And I see these paradigms as in economics as fitting into Kuhn's framework, where we have each paradigm has its own worldview, its own epistemology, its own methodology, and its own focus on particular questions. Now, Kuhn saw paradigms as incommensurate. And this is a concept that is often used when people are saying that Kuhn is a monist and not a pluralist, that there's no scope for communication between paradigms. Well, the fact that heterodox economists get together shows that can't be the case. And indeed, if you look at what Kuhn said himself, that's clearly not the case. I was privileged to meet Kuhn shortly before his death, as it turns out, and he was talking about how he came to these ideas. And he was a master's student, I think, in California at the time. And he'd been taught that Aristotle was a reasonably wise man in his time, but things had moved on, and astronomy was much better now, implying that Aristotle was a bit foolish. And he found this very difficult to take on board. So he started reading Aristotle, trying to think his way into what it must have been like for Aristotle when he was writing. How did he see the world? How was he using language, the words and the concepts? And his eyes were opened. And he realized that Aristotle was operating within a different paradigm, effectively. I mean, that's the way in which he built up his theory. So if you make an effort, you can understand other paradigms, but it does require an effort, and it does require recognizing that words may mean different things, concepts may be used differently, the world may be seen in a different way, the context is different. So I continue to find Kuhn a helpful way of understanding things. Now, to think about how the mainstream think about what is scientific, I looked at some introductory textbooks to see what they say, because I'm afraid most later textbooks don't even talk about methodology, but at least some introductory textbooks still do. And there are statements. Mankiw and Taylor, for example, have a section at the start of their textbook which is about thinking like an economist. You know, this is what this textbook is for. It's to teach you to think like an economist. And they say that the purpose is to think in terms of the scientific method. See, they're already saying, we know what science is, it's well established, We don't need to discuss it. There is scientific method, and we're going to teach you how to use it. And they spell out a scientific method which is one which you'll all recognize. It's because we come across it all the time. It's a logical positivist approach whereby axioms provide the foundation. Deductive logic is applied to develop theories, and then these theories are tested against the facts, which are regarded as independent. And that's how it's decided what are good theories and what are bad theories, which should be discarded. In other words, what Kuhn had shown wasn't, in fact, the way in which the physical sciences operate. So economics is presented as a technical discipline. It's a matter of techniques. It's divorced from values. It's not normative. The results of this technical analysis are handed over to the politicians who then make the decisions about policy, but that's not the business of economists. And it's cumulative. As time goes on, science gets better and better and better, economics gets better and better and better, and of course an implication of that is that there's no point in looking at the history of economic thought, because we keep on improving on it. Now, it's well established, a wide variety of commentators point out that within the mainstream, economics is defined by this method. It's the method that tells you what's economics and what isn't economics, what's science and what is not science. Now, people will talk about pluralism within the mainstream and point to the emergence of game theory and behavioral economics and so on. But if you look at what's going on there, it's taking a particular logical positivist framework with axioms and particular testing methods and trying to make the axioms more realistic, which, I mean, who could complain about that? And yet the structure of the argument still remains the same. We're still in the world of constrained optimization. So it's only a very limited form of pluralism, but pluralism in the sense that I want to talk about it is ruled out of order before you start because it doesn't fit in with science. It falls into the category of non-science if it doesn't accord with the mainstream's definition of scientific economics. But there are other paradigms, there are other schools of thought. And I think it's fairly safe to say, one should never say always, but I think all alternative paradigms define themselves by the subject matter, and the method follows from that. So that different paradigms will focus on the individual. From a subjective point of view, that would be the Austrian perspective, or institutions evolving over time, or a combination of agency and structure as we get in post-Keynesian economics. And the types of methods that are used follow from this way of understanding the world. Now, it's also generally true that heterodox economists see the world as an open system. In fact, Fred Lee defined heterodox economics as open system economics and the pluralism that follows. Now, the pluralism follows because if the subject matter is open, then it's evolving in complex ways which we cannot project into the future. We can't identify how these things are going to play out in the future. Our knowledge is uncertain. Creativity means new things emerging that we'd never thought of before. That's what creativity means. Institutions evolve discreetly sometimes in response to crises, as we've seen over the last few years. These are the things that we know in general things like this are going to happen, but we can't predict them precisely. Our knowledge is uncertain. We're looking for as reliable knowledge as we can, but we know that it's still going to be subject to uncertainty. Because this reality is so complex, inevitably there are going to be different perspectives on it. And a pluralist, from a normative sense, would actually like to foster this diversity of approach. And a common way of putting that argument is to use an analogy with biological diversity. You know, we know the idea that having a range of strains of a particular plant or animal is very useful, given that the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom likewise is subject to shocks and evolution and surprises in the same way as social structures. And it's very useful to have a range of possibilities so that at least one strain is going to be robust in the face of whatever it is that's developing. Now, Keynes is very helpful here in terms of helping us understand how we are building knowledge within this kind of framework. Keynes, like Hume, who was very much his inspiration, started in philosophy and only then moved into economics. And in his philosophy, the question that he was asking was, how do we, as scientists, as philosophers, or just in daily life, how do we establish reasoned grounds for belief as a basis for action? How do we function in a world where our knowledge is uncertain? So he dismissed very quickly the world of certainty, where it's possible for classical logic to be applied to axioms which are true in order to derive true conclusions. He said the general case is of an organic, social, or physical system, the knowledge of which is inevitably going to be uncertain. And therefore, what we need to employ, and what we do actually employ, is what he called human logic. So the mainstream, I mean, I've had these arguments with mainstream economists before, for whom logic is logic, end of story. But what they're talking about is classical logic. And for classical logic, the starting point has to be true if the propositions that arise from it have any chance of being true. It's like a chain where the axioms are the first link, and the propositions at the other end are only as strong as the first link, which is pinned to the wall. If that first link gives, then the whole chain collapses. Human logic, rather, is like a rope, which it uses multiple strands, none of which need to be at the start of the rope. They're all sort of coming in at different points, but all reinforce each other such that the strength of the rope is stronger than the strength of adding up all the strands. Human logic involves a pluralist methodology. It involves drawing arguments of different sorts together, drawing evidence of different sorts together. And these are different in a way which can't be collapsed into one. This is the whole point. We can use evidence, for example, from aggregate data about what's happening in financial markets. Or we can go and talk to bankers. Now, anybody who's conducted interviews knows that the kind of evidence you get from that kind of experience is not the kind of thing that can be fully formalized. It can be formalized up to a point. It can possibly be assigned numbers up to a point. But there is a sense you get from talking to somebody in a particular circumstance which goes beyond that. And that's the kind of thing I mean, that using different methods in order to build up a picture which helps us be less uncertain about our knowledge. And so Keynes talked about how we draw on evidence as much as we can, we use reason as much as we can, but there's still an awful gap there. So we rely on conventional judgments, we rely on expert judgment, and ultimately we rely on our guts. You know, and if going with other people isn't going to be enough to help us make a decision, we use our intuition effectively. So we have, in general life as well as in science, we use a pluralist methodology. Now, he introduced a very useful concept, which is the concept of weight of argument, that we can have more confidence in our expectations, uncertain though they may be, the greater the weight. Now, the simple form of weight refers to how much evidence we have. You know, if we've got data from many countries, this tells us more than data from one country, for example. But he said that weight increases with the amount of relevant evidence. Now, what's relevant is theory-specific. It depends on how we're looking at the world and the theories that we bring to the world, what we look for. To the extent that weight of evidence can actually end up falling, the more evidence we gather. And I mean, we had mention of Lehman's, the collapse of Lehman's. That was a huge shock across the financial sector. I mean, it was just a massive shock, and that's why we see that as the sort of pivotal point in the start of the crisis. That was a case where some new evidence emerged which showed that the theoretical perspective that had been used in the financial sector up till then was not very good, because it hadn't allowed for a crisis. It was built on the presumption that markets eventually will equilibrate. They might deviate for a while, but market processes will automatically equilibrate. So this was new evidence which revealed ignorance which had not been recognized before. So you can see how it's rather complex how one deals with the issue of reliable knowledge, because it all depends on your perspective and what you're picking up and what theoretical blinkers are stopping you picking up. Now, going back to this challenge to pluralism that it's not scientific, I mean, the classic put down is anything goes. You know, if you don't have one set of rules for how to do science everybody agrees on, well, you can do anything. That's surely not science. Well, put in that extreme way, it's not science, is it? I mean, if you can say anything, then how are we going to get anywhere? But of course, just because we don't agree on one set of rules about how to do science, that doesn't mean we actually do anything. Each paradigm has its own reasons and its own evidence to support the way in which it conducts inquiries, the way in which it builds up knowledge. They'll be different from the reasons in other paradigms. That's why paradigms are different. Each has its own criteria as to what's most scientific. I mean, obviously, in mainstream economics, one central criterion is that theory should be presented mathematically as an exercise in constrained optimization with equilibrium a central concept. But other schools of thought have different views about the extent of the use of mathematics, some more than others. But when we talk about schools of thought, I mean, we could argue about what the schools of thought in economics are, but I think you could manage it with two hands easily. There aren't so many schools of thought in economics. Now, why is that? Well, it's because, as Kuhn pointed out, and Popper before him, science is conducted within communities. We need to be able to discuss things with each other. We need journals to publish in. We need departments to teach in and classes to teach, and so on. We need to be able to communicate with each other. If we were, everybody in this room had their own paradigm, it would be completely hopeless because nobody would be, we wouldn't be able to achieve anything because it would be so difficult to communicate. I mean, trying to understand however many people are here, different paradigms is just a step too far. I wrote a book which dealing with 4 schools of thought in macroeconomics, and honestly, if I'd carried on with that much longer, I would have lost my mind because, in the morning I'd be thinking of as I'm trying to get, like Kuhn tried to get in Aristotle's head, I'd be trying to get into a mainstream economist's head, and then in the afternoon I'd be trying to be a neo-Austrian and trying to be a Marxist and then trying to be a post-Keynesian. And you can't keep it up. It's tough. We've all probably met people who we suspect are absolutely brilliant, but somehow they live in their own world and can't communicate whatever it is they're trying to say. I mean, that's the difficulty. We have to function within communities. And so when we're talking about pluralism, it's not anything goes. There are a limited number of communities, each of which has its own good reasons for the way in which they conduct economics. And this is what I call structured pluralism. Makes it sound a bit more definite and scientific, doesn't it, if you call it structured. But that's, I think there is substance there as well as rhetoric, but I did choose the word because of rhetoric in the first place. Now, what does this mean for economics if we're pluralist? I want to start just by talking about what being a pluralist means for the conduct of economics in general, economic research. And then I'll talk a little about a pluralist approach to policymaking, and then I'll finish with teaching, which of course is our focus here. And what I suggest is a set of positive heuristics and negative heuristics, do's and don'ts for a pluralist. The first positive heuristic is respect the legitimacy of alternatives. If you operate outside the mainstream, that's kind of obvious. But if you're a mainstream economist and you define economics such that it excludes pluralist heterodox economists, then it is actually an issue. Possibly even within heterodox economics, that it's possible that there's certain lack of respect pops up from time to time. So I think it's good to have it there as an injunction to respect the legitimacy of alternative approaches and try to understand them in order to keep up the possibility of communication. But in communication, be prepared to justify your own approach. Nobody has a monopoly on truth as a general proposition, but no economic paradigm has a monopoly on truth within economics. But in choosing a paradigm or letting a paradigm choose us, the responsibility is on us really to be able to justify that and be able to explain to somebody in an alternative paradigm why we approach economics the way we do, how, and help them try to understand. And indeed to encourage debate. We all know that how much we learn from debate by hearing another's perspective on the way we think. That really, and being forced to justify our own position is a great way of of developing our own thinking. And it also involves being open to the possibility of ideas coming from other paradigms. And I mean, a lot of the best pieces of PhD research I've seen in recent years has been doing just that. I mean, there's a lot of it going on, people taking an idea from one paradigm and seeing how it works in another one. Now, of course, it morphs, it changes its nature being taken from one paradigm into another because words and concepts are different. The whole scientific approach is different between one paradigm or another. But that's not to say it's not useful. Mainstream economists do it quite a lot, actually. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about uncertainty in mainstream economics, which is quite different from what I would mean by uncertainty. And other concepts have been taken on board. One always has to be careful to try and understand how concepts are being used differently in different paradigms. But one needs that kind of awareness of alternative paradigms in order to do that. Negative heuristics, the don'ts. Don't dismiss arguments from alternative approaches without good reason. It's very easy to dismiss alternative approaches just, just like that. But we need to respect each other enough to provide reasons why we prefer to go a different way. And by the same token, we shouldn't insist that everybody else should think like us. I mean, certainly we should argue. I mean, there's been a lot of misunderstanding of pluralism which takes its most extreme form as in anything goes, which is that you do your own thing and then you just shrug when you come across somebody who does something different. But if we think of pluralists, going way back, I think of Adam Smith, more recently Fred Lee, for example, these are fierce arguers, really trying hard to persuade other people that their way of thinking about things is best. And that is indeed what we should be doing, but it's a matter of persuasion. I mean, Keynes says you can't convict your opponent of error, you can only convince them. If nobody can demonstrate truth, then it is a matter of persuasion, trying to get other people to come on board with your way of thinking about things. Now, the third one refers to another misunderstanding that I feel has crept into the discussion of pluralism, and that is that you can sit in your study or your office and pick and choose from different paradigms, and that this is actually what being pluralist means. That you take a bit of this, take a bit of that, put it together. Now, what I've been trying to argue is that whenever you take something from one paradigm and put it in another, it changes. It may well add to that paradigm, but it's become something rather different. So you could pull from a whole number of paradigms and put them together, but that would become your new paradigm, which you would then have to try and communicate to other people. And if you're communicating it to members of each of the paradigms from whom you've borrowed, you're going to have a tough time because they're each going to understand their own bit in their own way. So to produce reliable knowledge, we have to be coherent. We have to have a coherent approach to knowledge. And the last don't is, I mean, I'm a methodologist, but we can't all be thinking about methodology all the time or philosophy of science. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just arguing for methodological awareness so that we make sure that we understand the philosophical foundations of our own approach, we do enough work to understand that of other approaches so we can have meaningful debates and meaningful creative borrowing from each other's paradigms. Now, just briefly, policymakers are in a particular situation. I mean, they should be coherent as well, although it's a bit tougher for them because they've got so many conflicting claims. And they, as politicians, they're very aware of pluralism within society, that there are different groups within society, different constituencies within society that they need to pay attention to. But for a policymaker, pluralism provides a much more reliable basis. So policymakers need to be aware that there are different approaches to economics, different perspectives on policy questions. So their advisors also need to be aware and be prepared to justify their own position. Mrs. Thatcher's said to have interviewed a very eminent economist for a position. And when he walked in the door, she said, "Do you believe in monetarism?" And he said, "Well, yes, but no buts." Out the door. Politicians and then their advisors need to be aware that there are different possible ways of looking at things in order for policy to be more robust. And the world keeps changing. So policymakers will want to draw on different types of theories for different purposes. For example, if you're pushing a policy of helping Eastern European countries liberalize their economies, it helps if you've got somebody around who knows something about institutions and the economic history of the economies that you're talking about. That a constrained maximization model is not going to do the job for you. And we're very familiar with the problems that these liberalization policies ran into because not enough attention was paid to institutions. And it would have been rather good if institutional economists had had more of a part to play. But finally, I'm going to get around to education. What does this mean for a pluralist education? Well, we want students to build up their reliable knowledge. And what I've been arguing, and in a way the premise of this whole event, is that pluralism provides the best basis for reliable knowledge. So it's not just economic researchers, but students also learn better through debates, getting an idea of what the key features are of different sides of an argument. And this is how things started with the post-statistic movement, that it was a plea for teaching by debate. And this also involves incorporating in some way or another history of thought and methodology in order to help students understand the foundations and the history of different perspectives in economics. And then, of course, since students write dissertations, specialize, are going to go on to be economists in the outside world, at some stage there has to be some choice of paradigm. There doesn't have to be. If it's a monist department and only one paradigm is taught, then that settles the matter. But if we're talking about pluralist teaching, then students need to be equipped to make that choice and understand what's involved in the different paradigms. Now, I mean, I said that I could count paradigms at least with two hands very easily. It's a tall order for any department to teach a whole lot of schools of thought, and in a way, the most important thing to my mind is to teach at least two. It's like learning languages. Once you've learnt a second one, you get the idea, and it's a lot easier to learn the third. Well, I think the same's true with economics. You get the idea that there is difference. There are different mindsets. And once you've got the hang of that idea, then the rest follows very, very readily. But finally, I mean, there was, in the introductory statements, there was mention about the moral obligations of economists. This too needs to be part of the education. If economics is a technical discipline and all the ethical decisions are taken by other people, then the notion, the ethics comes down to don't plagiarize and that kind of stuff. But if in fact economics is not a technical discipline, but rather has values built in from the start, then students need to be aware of that and be aware of what they're going to be doing in society if they're propagating a particular set of values through their economic advice. Further, if economics is a technical discipline, then there's no requirement to justify what you're doing. You know, there's this well-established scientific procedure, the economist just goes ahead and applies it, out pops a piece of policy advice. But that strikes me as profoundly immoral, because what it's doing is concealing the fact that there are values embedded there. It's getting across to society that something like austerity policies are justified on technical grounds, when in fact all sorts of value judgments have been embedded in the theory that came up with the idea of austerity policies as the best way to proceed. And students need to be helped to understand that there is a moral obligation in their interaction with policymakers, with companies, with students, as if they become teachers in turn, that an economist has a huge responsibility and needs to be upfront about that and not pretend that economics is purely a technical discipline. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time for discussion and Q&A. So if there are any questions, comments, remarks. Red. Do we have a microphone?
Do we have a microphone?
Okay. Oh, thank you here.
Thank you very much for the speech in the first place. And I was very much curious about one thing. So I saw your do's and don'ts for pluralist economist. And I was wondering if there was a do to pick the weaker side, something like that if you see that there is like such a strong dominance of one approach, would you say like a good pluralist considering which school to pick, he should go for one of those who are not currently the mainstream? And do you think it's like important to consider like the current balance of power in between, and then pick one of the sides which isn't really researched a lot?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, as an object of study, that seems a really good idea. In terms of your life choice, I'm not sure it's a good idea. Because it has to come from your ontology. Yeah, I mean, the trouble with mainstream economics is a lot of people don't feel comfortable with the ontology, and yet that it's presented that that's all it is. If you're going to feel comfortable in a school of thought, you've got to see the world in that way. But I mean, otherwise, you know, giving more attention to schools of thought that are not given much attention seems a nice idea. Mm-hmm.
Any other question? There's one in the back.
My name is Raoul Almeida. Well, my advisor was Ramon Garcia Fernandez. He's a great defender of pluralism in Brazil. He's a great methodologist, and he warned about a danger of the pluralism named strategic pluralism, because in Brazil, due to its peculiar evolution of economic thought, there are a lot of heterodox economies in influence positions, and there's a great dispute for the influence between the orthodox and the mainstream and the heterodox. So there's being observed some case of strategic pluralism, which means basically being a defender of pluralism in time one, and then rejecting pluralism in time two. And Ramon in his paper he mentioned some cases.
Can I just check I understand your question correctly? Are you saying that pluralists become monists when
Is a problem
they're in power?
of strategic pluralism, or basically game theory. Basically, in the present time, I am pluralist in order to advance my own my own my own theory. But when my theory gets a foothold, I stop it being pluralist.
Yes. I mean, this is an issue that's been discussed quite a lot among heterodox economists, whether heterodox economists are just pluralist because they're not mainstream. I mean, it's interesting you give the example of Brazil. I mean, in other circumstances, we haven't really had a chance to see how heterodox economists would be if they had a chance of being the orthodoxy. But I would simply repeat my argument that, I mean, a lot of heterodox economics isn't explicitly built on a philosophy of science, so that pluralism is not really embraced with explicit foundations, and is therefore probably not understood fully by some heterodox economists. But I mean, my argument applies to mainstream economists just as much as heterodox economists. Everybody should be prepared to justify their position. And the same would apply to heterodox economists were they to become the mainstream.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I have a little bit of a provocative question. And you said that knowledge, particularly economic knowledge in society, is uncertain in a way, right? Quoting Keynes, I think. And I would totally agree, but what does that imply? It does not mean that it's unorganized, right? And one topic or one theme that was missing in your talk, according to my opinion, is the question of power. Because we're not dealing with a level playing field here, and we have uncertainty of knowledge, of course, but as we heard also in the beginning, in the remarks, the knowledge is organized according to certain interest groups. There are employers associations which are heavily involved in teaching economics now in schools, but also if we look at who holds the positions at universities, so it's not a level playing field. And so my question would be, what is your take on how, I mean, what role does politics have in this, or power?
I completely agree that, I mean, power is a very important subject, which I didn't get into here. I mean, this is where the student movement's possibly going to shift the balance of power, because students are the customers. And demanding something different from the business which is universities. I don't know a lot about political science, and I'm therefore not equipped really to think about the future of political thinking. Maybe there's going to be some change in neoliberalism. Maybe governments are going to start thinking differently about the economy and see the virtue of alternative paradigms to the mainstream. I mean, the anti-austerity views are becoming more prevalent. I mean, a government's been elected in Canada on that ticket exactly. So I live in hope.
Yeah, my question goes in the same direction like the one of Aniel. I've found your arguments against monism very convincing. Also the description and the arguments in favor of pluralism. But what I missed a little bit is the way or how we can come from the one to the other. That means how a dominant paradigm can be challenged in favor of a more pluralist economics. And I guess this has a lot to do with power. And my question to you would be, what does your observation and your experience with studying the development of science tell us about the possible or the preconditions for such a transition process? I guess it has to do with power within the scientific system, but it has also to do with the power in society, with the hegemony of neoliberal thinking, and how this is inscribed into the scientific system. So I could imagine that there is some kind of that there's a connection between power in society, power in the scientific system, and that they mutually influence each other. So what would be the preconditions from your philosophy of science perspective? What would be the preconditions for a transition from one paradigm to the other?
Yes, I mean, you're all raising such good questions. I mean, if we take a Kuhnian perspective, what's required is an anomaly that just becomes too great to bear. And you would like to think the crisis would be one such anomaly. And it's maybe gradually feeding in. Adam Smith drew a distinction between the physical sciences and the social sciences. I mean, not that there were social sciences like that in his day. He said that the physical sciences can go off on a ridiculous path because people in society in general can't relate to what's being done. It's too technical, too specialist, and therefore it isn't challenged. The social sciences, he said, are subject to this kind of challenge because we deal in the analysis of everyday life. And therefore, we are all kept in check if our theories depart too much. Now, what seems to me to have happened, this is why in my work, I keep coming back to this fact that mainstream economics presents itself as a technical discipline, as scientific in that sense. That what they've conveyed to society is that there's a specialist subject that's too difficult for people to understand. We're just technicians, we're not messing with society, it's the politicians that do that. We're just producing technical results. And that's what strikes me as being at the heart of the problem in terms of communicating with society. And if we can chip away at that, I mean, I don't know if anybody here is looking for a PhD topic. I think it would be a great topic to take modern mainstream theory and just draw out really explicitly what the values are embedded in that. I mean, there have been some philosophical history of thought theses. I've supervised one which have done that, really good. But I think in terms of communicating with society, it would be just wonderful to have something that picked out, say, austerity policies. What's the value system that's embedded there that economists are not willing to admit is there. Now, I mean, there are signs that, you know, the Occupy movement, obviously, but also with the student movement, that there is a bit of there is momentum going there. And what's particularly important about the student movement is that a lot of it has to be generational. You know, hopefully, you know, within a few decades, there are going to be people in positions of power in university who've been through good pluralist political economy programs and are teaching their students and are advising governments in that way and being upfront about the values that they're using and the fact that they don't have a monopoly on the truth, but they've got really good arguments. And I'm an optimist, so I hope that this is something that is going to emerge. I mean, mainstream's been remarkably tenacious and is very clever in the way in which it's absorbed ideas and presented them as dealing with the mainstream. But I mean, if I may just, when I was talking to somebody before I was coming here, I was being asked what am I going to talk about. And the question was, well, how about astrology? You know, should we respect astrology? I mean, possibly there's some astrologers here, I don't know. But I mean, that's a field where there are many paradigms would look at that field and say, no, I don't think there are very good arguments there. And it made me think about mainstream economics. All these different heterodox schools of thought agree that mainstream economics is not satisfactory. It doesn't live up to the way in which it's billed. It's really hard to justify. I mean, I would still keep mainstream economics within the plurality because some people clearly believe in it, but I'd want to hear their reasons. And mainstream economists will never present the reasons for doing economics in the way they do. It's just taken for granted that this is science, end of story. So, I mean, there was a suggestion that we maybe pick on some small schools of thought. I mean, maybe all the schools of thought should continue picking on the mainstream. And I mean, if there is agreement that there's something really unsatisfactory, then you know, maybe there's something going for it.
We have time for one very, very short question and a short answer before we have to finish.
Okay. My name is David Barkin. I'm coming from Mexico. Are any of the pluralisms that you're talking about recognizing that the economic system is embedded in society and in turn in the planetary system? And connected with that, what about those societies who are trying and actually doing some good job of operating outside what is called the capitalist economic system? And we're trying to organize life and our territory in a more balanced way.
Indeed, I would include that. I mean, you're asking me if I'd include that in my pluralism.
Well, I'm asking if you have identified. I've never, in your writings, I've never seen anything that you address that issue.
Right. That is not to convey my opinion of work in that or activity in that area at all. I mean, I'm engaged. I've been involved in activities and discussions and research which does address those issues. But I guess you're right. I haven't written about it. But I shall bear that in mind. Thank you for pointing that out.
thank you very much. The official part of this conference continues tomorrow at 9 a.m. Please be in time. We have a tough schedule ahead. And now have a nice evening and let's have some drinks. Thank you.